moving to another country for the very first time can bring a whole range of emotions, from excitement to loneliness to complete chaos. It's an experience that is too often a foreign concept for most native-born Americans. In her latest book, A Beginner's Guide to America, Iranian-born journalist, poet, and writer Roya Hakakian attempts to bridge the knowledge gap, giving readers a view of the U.S. through an immigrant's eyes. And she joins us now to discuss her book and her experiences. Thank you so much for joining us. I understand, because though I'm Canadian, so it's a much closer sort of a much closer culture to the American culture, there's still some differences. And so often I feel kind of like, a stranger in a strange land, even though you can't tell from the outside. So you were born in Iran and left as a teenager to come to America in the mid-1980s. How much of this book comes from your own personal experiences, and what do you hope that people who are born in the U.S. actually learn from it?
Good morning. I wanted to make The Immigrant truly accessible to the native-born, because in 2016, when the anti-immigrant rhetoric reached a fever pitch, and reporters, journalists, politicians, policymakers were all speaking on the behalf of the immigrant, I thought I should try to be the voice of the immigrant. I should try to make the immigrant someone that readers can feel, can touch, whose thoughts they can hear, and maybe through that the immigrant becomes less fearsome, because we were hearing all this rhetoric about immigrants being dangerous for our country and committing crimes and all that, and I thought, let me make the immigrant more accessible. So I remember arriving when I was 19 and being entirely overwhelmed and filled with grief. I don't know whether coming from Canada to America gave you those feelings, but certainly those were my immediate initial feelings.
You know what I really love about your book? It's important because for the first time, I'm able to actually sort of think about what my parents must have felt like when they came to this country. As a little kid, you want to assimilate, at least you try to assimilate as best as you can, and I know this is going to be, horrible for some people to hear, but it's just the reality of what life was like growing up in the 70s in this country. You kind of want to distance yourself from your immigrant parents who are screaming at each other in their native tongue in the supermarket, right? And you feel uncomfortable because children are embarrassed easily. But when I read through your book, I get a sense of what it must have been like for my mom, who was young and came to this country, didn't speak the language, didn't speak it well while she was going to school, and all the things that you experienced, she experienced. And for somebody who says, well, you should talk to your mom about it, well, you know that the older generation, they never really give any insight into how difficult things were, because they're all about, pushing through and getting it done and not worrying about what people say or the strange looks that you're getting from strangers, right? And so this really gave me a little insight into what she must have felt like, and it made me a little ashamed to have been that little kid who was like, Mom, stop speaking to me in French, speak to me in English. We're in America now.
Precisely. I mean, people ask me, as you just did, how much of this is your experiences? Some of the book is, in fact, my own observations and eyewitness accounts. But I think at the end of the day, like your parents, like me, by the time we go through this transplanting experience of bringing ourselves across the oceans, across the borders, and starting a new life in a country we don't know, in a culture we don't understand, in a language we have no mastery of, we all became somewhat alike. So I think at the end of the day, whether I'm from Iran and your parents are from a French-speaking culture, we all become somewhat similar by the time we merge together to try to all begin a life in a new country. And I thought that the best thing we can do in order to make immigrants a little less scary and a little less threatening to the rest of the country was to make those feelings those thoughts, those anxieties more accessible to everybody else in the country, which is something that I think has been missing from our immigration conversation nationally.
Your book talks about sort of hating an immigrant community as part of America's hazing ritual. Can you explain what you meant by that?
You know, it's an ironic thing. Every immigrant community, at one point or another, has been subject to this, mistreatment by the majority society. Whether it was the French at the end of the 18th century, Germans in the middle of the 18th century, Jews when they arrived running away from the Holocaust in the middle of the 20th century. Every community was at one point or another unwelcome in this country. And I suppose the strange good news here is that at the end of the day, within a generation or two, they were all brought in and they all wove themselves into the fabric of the broader society. So while we have always resisted them, we have also, within a generation or two, brought them in and accepted them as part of this beautiful tapestry of the multi-ethnic country that America is.
Roya, your book also touches on the plight of Black Americans and serves as almost a cautionary tale for non-white newcomers. Talk about how the history of slavery in this country, the civil rights movement, how they have impacted immigrants and how they perceive African Americans and their situation in this country.
Precisely. I have tried to always think about what it was that made me more comfortable in America as an outsider. And I say this because while I was a refugee in Europe waiting for my asylum application to be approved to America, I lived in a couple of different countries in Europe, and I never received the welcome, or I was never as comfortable as I ultimately was in America. So what's the quality that makes America somewhat more receptive than other Western societies to these newcomers? And one of the most important reasons, I think, is the fact that this society has always had to confront the matter of inequality at its core. That the movement for equality by African Americans in this country from hundreds of years ago till today has created this national debate about equality, about egalitarian values. And it is into that conversation that the immigrant enters. And it is from that conversation that the immigrant, who's also an outsider, benefits. And I think we all, as immigrants, owe a debt of gratitude to this African American movement for equal rights, because one way or another, we're all beneficiaries of the space that they have created within the American society to make otherness more acceptable. And it is into that space that we slip in. And it is through that wonderful perspective that the tolerance for us in part comes from as well.
Roya, I think that point is absolutely fascinating. And in that answer, you talked about, living different places while you waited. And I think that people who are native born have no idea how challenging it is to get into this country, not just when you're sort of crossing, from Mexico. I mean, it's challenging for everyone to come into this country. It's expensive. You wait a long time. You never know what the outcome's going to be or where you're going to end up. And it's always occurred to me that the people who are granted permission to come here, and I'm one of those people, are incredibly appreciative. And it is easy to be patriotic. You have to want to be here to get here. It's not by accident. And I always feel like, perhaps native-born Americans miss that. That immigrants are appreciative, that they are patriotic, that they came here because they love this country.
Precisely. You just summarized my entire book in a way, in a few short sentences. So what did I do?
But we still want people to buy it. We still want people to buy it.
But it's true. I feel like we work for it, right? We undergo tests that the native-born would never subject themselves to. You know how many physical exams, medical exams, security exams, and all sorts of poking and prodding an immigrant undergoes in order to have security checks, the vetting process, the medical, health approval, for all these things to come through. I know of very few native-born Americans who are willing to put themselves through these processes. And besides, I don't know anybody who's been born and raised here who's actually looked at the naturalization application or the green card application. Mm-hmm. These are hefty documents that ask you questions that a native-born person might never have wondered about or asked. And so I think it is in this process of constantly engaging with these questions, with these endless interviews, with these, constant tests that make us think about, do we really mean it? Do we really want to go there? And I think as a result, exactly as you said, we become more committed, more thoughtful citizens that most native-born Americans already are. I mean, they are American citizens because they were born here. It's something that was granted to them through a birth certificate in a hospital when they had no consciousness about what it was like to be an American. We earn it, we work for it. And I think, therefore, we are able to see things, to see values within the society that may be invisible to those who've been born and raised, and think of all of these gifts that exist here as just part of the decor. We know what each one of them means, and we celebrate them more seriously than the rest.
I can get behind that. Roya Hakakian, thank you so much. Really, really interesting and illuminating conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
A Beginner's Guide to America is available right now.